Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I know that people are gradually coming in. Beth is letting them in as they sign on. Welcome to Learning Lab's webinar series. I'm Lark Park. I'm director of the Learning Lab. And we're really excited to have Karen Givvin today as our very first speaker for our very first webinar, How to Launch a Networked Improvement Community. Before I introduce Karen, I just wanted to say a word about why we launched this series. First of all, I think most of you know that our grant community has grown quite a bit, from 9 funded projects in our first year to 30 funded projects total as we close out our second year. So we were really busy last year trying to open up new grant opportunities to fund innovative projects and for new teams to join the Learning Lab community. And we anticipate announcing another grant opportunity in the fall. Second of all, we hosted an all teams meeting last fall for our year 1 funded projects where we gathered grantees in person, which now seems like a very long time ago, I'm sure. And there was definitely appetite for grantees to hear more about each other's projects and create greater networking opportunities among our grantees. And then thirdly, we're in unprecedented times. As many of you know, we sent out a survey in April in an attempt to really understand what was happening on the ground in the wake of COVID and how faculty were doing with these challenges, what the needs were, and a number of you responded. And you provided the basis for the brief we published and distributed a couple of weeks ago called Class Interrupted, Faculty Needs in the Time of COVID-19. And it became obvious to us through the responses that a lot of faculty were relying on other faculty, and in many cases, they were really relying on you to help navigate the shift to remote instruction. And so we thought that creating and sustaining faculty community would be really important to navigating these really difficult times. And so we wanted to share the important work that all of you are engaged in, especially the online and hybrid components within our grant community and beyond the grant community as well, in effort to try to be helpful, as helpful as possible to all of you as you all prepare for fall instruction. So our first few webinars are focused on, I think, timely and practical things. In addition to the webinar today, we have a webinar scheduled in late August on how to humanize online instruction, which is probably very timely at this point. And another one we're in the process of scheduling about how to deploy learning assistance in an online world. So please watch out for those. So without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce Professor Karen Givvin, who is a proud team member of the Better Book Project out of UCLA. And I just want to say, I really love the title of this project because it's succinct, it's catchy, it's optimistic. And I would encourage all grant teams to have, a short title, a short catchy title for their project as well if you don't already have one. In any case, Karen is an adjunct faculty member at UCLA in the Department of Psychology. She received her PhD in education from UCLA. She has a master's from CSUN, Northridge, in educational psychology and counseling, and she has a bachelor's in psychology from UCLA as well. She's a proud 100% product, no dilution, of California public education. And I asked Karen the question yesterday, as a child, what did she want to be when she grew up? Because that's a very important question, I think. And she said that when she was young, she wanted to be a 4th grade math teacher. And then she got more specific. She wanted to be Mr. Ellis when she grew up, who was her 4th grade math teacher. And so even though I know that Mr. Ellis is not on this webinar, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge Mr. Ellis of Eugene Field Elementary in Pasadena, because it highlights again the influence that all teachers and all faculty have on the lives of students, both in remote education, in times of remote education, and in times of in-person education. So the last thing I want to say about Karen is that she recently took up rowing, so you have to know she's probably hardcore on the inside. So with that, and without any further ado, Dr. Karen Givvin.
Thank you, Lark. And thank you for all of you for joining us here on a Friday when I'm sure you have other things calling your attention. So hopefully I'll provide you some good reason to be here. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so as Lark pointed out, I'm at UCLA, but our group is representing also Cal State LA and LA Pierce College. So we are crossing the higher ed span in California with a really marvelous group of people. Just to give you an outline to start, my intent today is to cover these 5 basic areas. So the who, the what, the where, the why, the where, and the how. So some pretty standard kinds of questions in a sort of atypical order, but it was an order that worked for me. So that's why it's a little jumbled up. For you math people, I count myself among you, they are not equal fractions of the talk, so don't anticipate them being equally represented. So we'll just start by talking about the who. So so today's talk is about networked improvement communities. So it seems appropriate to start with who the network participants are. And if we're going that direction, what we're really going to be talking about are key players in good instruction. And you'll recognize these, of course. So key players include researchers. So those are the people who do the science that investigates teaching and learning, and hopefully bring that to bear on what happens in classrooms. But there are researchers that are part of good instruction. They hopefully bring their findings to designers and developers who in turn create instructional materials and deliver those to instructors who in turn, like they're the ones in the trenches, the forward-facing people to the student who deliver those instructional materials. So key players certainly include these 3 groups. And it's also true that there might be some people who like bridge the gaps between these groups as well. But if we move the designers and developers over for a moment, we'll make room for one other. If we anthropomorphize course materials, I think we can also think of them as a key player in good instruction. So the way this process usually works is that we have researchers working in labs, mostly on, or a lot of the times on university undergraduate students in introductory psychology courses, because they're the ones to which we have immediate access. And we study learning, usually in 1-hour blocks, just because that's how things are most easily set up. Granted, we do work in other ways as well, but what we do gets delivered, hopefully, to designers and developers, right? So the people who are, whether they be independent or with publishing companies, the people who are putting together instructional materials, right? So the learnings that we take from the lab and from field work are delivered to designers and developers who develop course materials. And then those course materials, through some form of professional development, hopefully, are delivered to instructors. Now, what I think is critical in this diagram is the directionality of the arrows. And in most cases, there is flow in one direction only, right? There's very little communication back normally from instructors back to designers and developers, and even less back to researchers. And we see that as a problem, right? And in fact, there's often really a barrier between those groups. So researchers do their thing, designers and developers do their thing together with course materials, and instructors do their thing. This can turn into a very poor game of telephone. So I certainly have seen firsthand some projects where researchers have delivered what they thought was and I will say what we thought was a well-articulated set of core beliefs that we thought should go into curriculum materials. We delivered that to a group of designers and developers, and what we saw produced as a result was not at all what we had intended. whatever the case may be, those materials get delivered to instructors, and then you still have the problem of implementation. So it could be that even if the instructional materials are created in such a way that they reflect the research, it might still not be the case that they are implemented in a way that's consistent with the intent. So what you're left with, given this flow, first essential problem is that we're working in silos, right? We're not communicating enough across those barriers. And speaking particularly to the problems with research, often our studies lack ecological validity. So if we're doing lab experiments that take less than an hour to complete, then we're not doing a good job of looking at what it takes to learn something deeply and learn something hard and learn something big that takes a long time to learn, right? Our understanding of the world is not made up of 1 hour bits of information. It also leads to a lack of translational or implementation research. So what we're studying should not take place just in the lab, but we should be completing that loop and working with instructors to figure out what's going on in their classrooms in terms of implementation. And there is a persistent gap between teaching research that's related a bit to what I've said. And overall, there's a lack of a systems focus, right? Teaching and learning and research on those topics takes place in a system, and we need to treat it as such, right? So we need to acknowledge the full system that exists in terms of helping students learn. And this is really what we foresee, right? I'm going to go back because this is probably my favorite transition of the whole talk, and it's worth seeing again. Right, so this is the standard, and this is what we want, right? So this is our better book approach. As an aside, since Lark brought it up, the better book title that we have for our project, that itself was the result of some iterative improvement with an improvement coach. We actually, on a day that Mike Rother came to UCLA to join us and give a workshop on improvement science, we at the time were trying to come up with what would be a good title, and the better book was the result. It actually was his suggestion. So this is our vision. So it is researchers, instructors, and designers and developers working in collaboration on equal footing, and all of them collaborating around course materials, right? That's really what we'd like to see happen and what we're trying to create. So we want to build R&D communities. That's just another way of saying networked improvement communities around development and continuous improvement of high impact courses. So the two new things in that little phrase, continuous improvement, that's something that we believe in firmly. So what we're not trying to do is to develop what we think is the perfect set of instructional materials and pass it off, right? We started with creating version 1 of the materials, and we foresee continuing to improve it, gosh, forever. I don't know that I can't foresee the point where we'll ever be truly satisfied with it. So it's really an important process of continuous improvement. And then the other new part on this slide is this idea of high impact courses. Now we figured that if we're going to take on something so difficult, we might as well do it in a place that has an impact. So and that a lot of people care about and should care about. So so we chose high impact courses. And our strategy for doing this is to learn by doing. So we actually wanted to get in the trenches and build this course and build the networks around the work that's being done to figure out exactly where the problems lie and try to work through them. So that's the who. That brings us to the what. And so the object around which we want to collaborate. So the object for us is Course Kata, Introduction to Statistics, a Modeling Approach. So Course Kata is actually a platform, an online platform for delivering instructional materials. We created it. We created it with this larger project in mind. we foresee, and we hope in the not too distant future, that it will house many courses, right? The platform itself is agnostic to course content. And we see some exciting elements for putting other courses on it. For now, what appears on Course Kata is our Introduction to Statistics course. Yeah, and I'm going to explain the course a little bit just because it helps understand the network that we've built and how we interact. So the first thing to know is that Introduction to Statistics is a fully instrumented interactive textbook. Now we do pitch it as a textbook. In part, it's to make it sound a little less ominous, and it helps a little bit with adoption as well. So if we have instructors understand, and administrators and campus administrators understand that it can be a replacement for a textbook, it's a little easier to implement than claiming it to be a completely new class. So it's an interactive textbook, and in that way it actually has some features of a standard textbook. So we keep the jargon of chapters and pages. So it has 12 chapters. Each of them has about 10 pages approximately of materials. And the pages, of course, are web pages, but we refer to them as just pages. What's different is that the narrative is interleaved with questions, exercises, and video. And I'll show you some examples, but I think this is right off the bat an interesting feature of our work, and something that sets it apart and made it a little difficult for us to get started. The whole reason that Course Kata as a platform exists is that we couldn't find something that served our purposes. So what we really wanted to do is have this interleaving of different elements, and on a single page be able to go back and forth between text, questions about the text, exercises. If you're not familiar with it's a statistical package, open source and free, which is handy, and videos about the content. And we wanted to be able to go back and forth freely on any given page between those elements. And I'll show you now what some of that looks like. So this first, I apologize, all of your faces are in my way at the moment. These screenshots are from a single page on variance. And what you can see in the top left screenshot is there's a little bit of text. There is an open-ended question to be answered by students. There is actually a submit button hiding under this box. And then there's more text. Further down the page, you come across an coding exercise that students submit right on the page. In this case, we actually gave the output. We did want it, what follows is a question about the output. So we wanted to make sure that students had it available to them, even if they got stuck on the coding exercise. Right, so there's, just in the short section of a single page, there's text, there's an open-ended question. That's, oops, sorry. So there's an open-ended question, coding, and multiple choice, right? The other element that we have on pages is video, and this is a video of our beloved Dr. G. So there are more than 20 videos throughout the course where G does a really nice job of bringing together some concepts all in a single place, right? So these elements appear throughout the course, and the important thing about them, and the reason that I bring them up in this context, is all of them generate data for us. So all of those activities generate data. The first one that I showed, that open-ended question, so this is the question, what I showed at first was the view of the question from the student's perspective. This is the view of the question from the teacher's perspective. Oops. And what you can see is that in this class, this was actually Jim Stigler's winter class, he had 256 enrolled students, 253 attempted this question, right? And now if I'm Jim and I see this before I go into my lecture, I might want to know how students did on that question. Were they understanding it? Were they confused? So I would just click on the responses from students button. That would bring up a pop-up window. And these are actually the first several responses to that question, right? So I can get an idea. This first person, so the question is about, can you think of a way to measure error that would not be influenced by sample size, right? So the first person is confused, even says they're not sure. Second person had a very clear understanding of, that it is something to do with variance and standard deviation. You wouldn't want to get an average of some sort. So maybe this student wasn't getting exactly the variance and standard deviation part, but they get a sense of what it is, right? So as a teacher and as a researcher, I can get some sense of how students are understanding the material at this point in the text, right? For the R coding exercises, again, there were 253 out of 256 students in this class responded to it. I can see here that 86% of the students got it correct. And if I want to see what their responses were, I can just pull those up. And this is R coding, so of course, many of the responses are going to be very similar. But I can also see how many attempts they took before they got it correct, right? So I can see there's not too much variation. R is lovely in that there are multiple ways to do the same thing. So you can see, for instance, those bottom two rows, those are both perfectly appropriate responses. And the ones who were off were not off so much. They were off by, like, for instance, this person had a capital D instead of a lowercase d, things like that. So I can get a sense of, again, at the point where students are on this page, what were they understanding at that time? And then finally, the multiple choice kinds of questions. Again, we see the number of students, 74% of students got this one correct, but I can also see we were very deliberate about how we wrote these questions. I can also see where they are choosing particular incorrect responses. So I might want to take a look at the difference between the responses of C and D in this case, and what was it that was drawing some people to the D response, right? So we get a very good understanding of student thinking. We even collect data from videos, right? So in fact, we have a student in our lab, Laura, who's writing her dissertation on a study based on video use and students' use of video and their understanding. And so this is an example. Something interesting here, on these questions, we kept repeatedly seeing that 253 students responded, right? And that's what it was on the open-ended question as well. So we know that they're engaged in the page, but what we see here is only 54 students actually watched the video. We hear a lot. I'm hearing a lot now with everyone going remote that, oh, the answer is post-video. Students love video. Well, they watched it far less, even just watched it, far less than we thought that they were going to. So we're already learning some about that. And here too, we can see that there's no question to answer here, but we get some usage data. So we get the percent who watched it, but also the percent of time that they watched, because they don't always watch the whole thing. Sometimes they watch it more than once. So we get a sense of that as well. So all of the interactive elements of the course produce data for us. This one is actually the download if you were to click information from all students, and then you get a sense of how many times they accessed it, the proportion of the video that they watched, and the proportion of the time. You can also get some interesting data about when they watched it. So this student here who watched it twice, watched it on January 23rd and came back to it on January 31st, and probably watched it each time almost in full. So we can say a lot about what students are doing as they're interacting with the course. So all of that data is grist for discussion. So we really do try to keep all of our discussion grounded in what we know to be true, right? And those discussions lead directly to course improvement, which points us at, the why part, the need for a NIC, right? So why do we need a networked improvement community? So we started with what we believe to be a really ambitious goal. So what we wanted to do is we are aiming at transferable knowledge of introductory statistics for all students, not the top students, not students at any particular college, but we are implementing this at Cal State LA, at UCLA, and at LA Pierce College. At LA Pierce College, the class is after AB 705, it's one of those classes that into which what the students who would have been in a remedial community college math class often end up in this class. We want to teach them too, this transferable knowledge. So if we think for a moment about the domain of statistics, and I'm guessing that all of you have had at least one statistics course in your pocket, these are probably very familiar terms, right? So you talk about statistics and parameters, and you run t-tests and ANOVA, and you talk about chi-square and z-scores, and quartiles and p-values, right? But what often happens is that you learn those little bits of information, and you might even learn them to mastery. You might be a whiz at running a t-test, right? But you have no idea how a t-test is related to ANOVA, or have no idea that ANOVA is related to regression, right? And for me, this rings so true. I know in my graduate school interview, I was asked by the person who became my advisor what I hoped to get out of graduate school. And one of the things I remember telling her was that I know how to run a t-test, I know how to run a chi-square and ANOVA, but I never know which to run when, right? Because they had always been given to me like, this is the chapter on t-tests. I know how to do it. Here's the test on t-tests. Great. I'll apply the t-test every time. I can do that, right? So I certainly, even though at that point I had had 2 inferential statistics classes, I did not see the connections whatsoever, right? So what usually ends up happening is that students learn the bits, but they don't see the connections. And if they don't see the connections, they can't transfer the information, right? If they're given a new context, they don't know when and how to apply what they know, right? And that's true. If I think of myself as a good student, that's true even for good students, right? That's not the thing that differentiates the good from the bad. This is just a problem across the board. So we think a lot about this. So what we're really after is the ability to connect and transfer information. So if you think of, if I give you some visual image to go with this is a guy who has all of these ideas in his head, those letters you can think of as ideas and knowledge about concepts. And he's trying to solve a problem. And the answer to the problem, the way to get to the answer to the problem is B, right? But he can't find a way there. He keeps thinking E, that connection is really strong. Might think of D, right? But he has no path to B. So he has few connections, and that's problematic for him. If, on the other hand, the same person had many connections, it might be something more like this, right? So there's still that strong connection to E. That might lead to D. And lo and behold, D, if it's connected to B, that can get him there, right? Or in this case, he might think of H. That might bring him to the thought of A, then to F. Oh, B, right? Or he might go on another path, he thinks D might lead directly to B, right? The more connections you have, the more tools you have at your disposal. So we really want students to come away understanding how all of these concepts are related, right? So our goal, in a word or several words, is to activate, represent, coordinate, and flexibly adapt statistical concepts and skills in novel situations, right? That's what we're after. And some of the theories we're testing related to that. So this might seem like an obvious, but if our goal is transfer, why don't we just have students practice transfer, right? Instead of, if that's what we want in the end, why are we treating things as individual bits? Why don't we repeatedly get them to transfer and make those connections? So that's what we're trying to do. Which leads to the obvious questions, well then, what kinds of connections do you try to make, right? It's one thing to, give an admonition, connect things. Like, great, like what? So what we're trying to do repeatedly as threads throughout the course is that we're trying to connect core concepts. So the core concepts that we've chosen after Jim Stigler and Ji Sun did a very thorough thinking through of the content related to not just introductory statistics, but also some of the statistics that will follow. So even if we're not testing and teaching things that are to come, we don't want to lay some groundwork that some later person needs to undo, right? So based on that, the things that we try to connect throughout are core concepts. And in this case, those core concepts are statistical model. So data equals model plus error. We repeatedly talk about the distribution triad. So there's the data generating process and sample data and sampling distributions, right? So those three distributions and when you apply each. And we also talk a lot about randomness. Right, so students and people in general have an inclination to look for causality. That's something we do naturally as humans, but not everything is causal. So we keep bringing things back to random. And what would random look like? And is what we see consistent with randomness? If what we see is not consistent with randomness, then we consider that it might be causal, and then we can explore the causality. Right, so those are core concepts that we come to repeatedly. We also have multiple representations. So we do a lot with visualizing data. We start there really. So present a lot of histograms and box plots and scatter plots. Visualizations of all kinds. We put things in terms of what we call word equations. So that's representing in words that idea of data equals model plus error. And that leads nicely to a discussion of the general linear model, which is also a form of data equals model plus error. And in a handy way, there is R code available that also maps very nicely onto that representation. So we really enforce the idea of data equals model plus error in many different formats, in words, in GLM, and in R code. And then we also connect to the real world, right? That's a wonderful thing about statistics. And of course, right now we see it everywhere. I don't know about you, but I refresh several tabs every morning to look at the new data about COVID. So we do real data analysis with real data sets, often drawn from 538, also from lock, and lock. So real data with, with real important, interesting questions. We're very excited that we've just fully integrated Jupyter notebooks on our platform. So not only are students working with real data, they're working on a platform in the way that a real data scientist would, right? So in that sense, they're doing real things in a real way that someone in the field would recognize, right? And the things that we ask them to do are things like, and it's the way that the textbook is set up, explore variation, model variation, and then evaluate models, right? Those are the things that data scientists do, and those are the things through the course, through the use of the book, that our students learn how to do. So those are the connections we're trying to practice throughout. So all of that is to say that testing something new, we really think that this is something new. It takes multiple perspectives. and a conscious, deliberate process, right? We realize that what we are trying to do goes against the grain a little bit. It's not just the same old as any other textbook you might see. So that's really why, that's the answer to the why question. That's why we need a networked improvement community that brings in multiple perspectives and has us interact around the materials to see what's working and what's not and what can be improved, right? Okay, so then there's the question of the where. So how is it that we do our work now? The cheeky answer, of course, is Zoom, because that's where we all do everything. In fact, for us, we were working with our NIC on Zoom in large part anyway. So that for us, when we made the transition to working at home, it just meant a sort of a different backdrop for everyone. But we all were already on Zoom. Okay, so settings. That's a term that we take from a colleague of ours, Bill Saunders, who works a lot with groups of teachers. So settings it's more than a meeting. It's not just the when, but also the where and the routines around which you meet. So these are some of our communities. So we have one community that combines designers, developers with instructors, right? So that's that community generally does its work through kickoff meetings and that we've done in the summers. Workshops, we have a series of workshops coming up this next week. If we have piqued your interest here and you want to learn more about course kata statistics, we have some workshops going on Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week. Just this morning at 9 o'clock, we finished up our big summer study group. So we worked with a group of instructors 3 days a week for 5 weeks, working through together the first 6 chapters of the book. And we also meet by office hours, and some of those will be going on next week as well. So we have multiple settings in which designers and developers work with instructors. We also have settings in which instructors work with researchers. So we meet every week in office hours. This past year, it was on Fridays. We had, at the beginning of the year, asked instructors if they would please check in once every 2 weeks with us, and we were sort of hoping that they would do that. In fact, we ended up seeing most of them every single week. It turned out to be a really wonderful community. I think it became very apparent that community college in particular, so it's instructors at community colleges and Cal State schools, the higher ed instructors who are really focused on instruction can be somewhat starved for a community with whom to work. So it was fun to see them every week. And then we also meet monthly. We're also really proud and happy to have on our team Eddie Turchian, he's not an instructor, but in some ways he fits in this group, that he's the math chair at Pierce College, and he's a co-PI on the project. So he's working in these communities as well. Then we have times at which designers, developers meet with researchers. So over the summer, we've been meeting in daily stand-ups, in part to replace some of our in-person gatherings. We also have weekly sprint meetings. We've taken on the use of a Jira board where we keep track of all of the work that we need to do. We also have sprint meetings with an external consultant, Edify. It's a program that they are helping us to build the platform. And so we meet regularly with those platform developers. And then we have consultants on the project as well. So for instance, we have Chris Holloman, who is an expert in motivation, part of the Motivate Lab at UVA, and part of the Mindset Scholars Network. And so we meet with him and regularly. And as of August 1st, we'll have a postdoc who will be part of that team. And then there's, if I can go forward. There's one that this last little community is one that we had not anticipated, but we were excited to find. It sort of developed organically. The course, we implemented a Zoho desk. So there's a help button in the course that students can press to either look up words in an index or find common, there's an FAQ, and they can also file tickets. And so we hear from students directly if they have identified a problem or have a question. Sometimes we forward things on to instructors and sometimes we deal with them internally. But we hadn't really anticipated having a direct line to students, but in fact, we do now. So each of these is something that we think of as a community, and so we have a network improvement of communities, and the improvement, of course, is always, all of these groups is focused on improving the course materials based on the data coming out of course usage. And to give you some examples of what we've learned from all of those groups and the data that we get, there is a wide range. So sometimes, and students are particularly good at these, there are typos, and so things like that, not terribly exciting, but I will be excited when we never ever get any typos anymore. And the frequency is definitely going down, but anyway, so those are, they're of course things that we become aware of that don't require any discussion to fix, and so we just fix that straight away. But there are also things that come up in the NIC that really take discussion to solve. So, and they are, generally some content questions. So, for instance, when you're teaching introductory statistics based on modeling, do you teach the null model and then teach a single explanatory, a model with a single explanatory variable? Or do you do the reverse? I mean, the null might be more obvious because it's easier, but because it's a bad model, it can be a confusing place to start, because why, students wonder, are you teaching us a bad model? So that's something around which we've had some discussion. There are also things that come up in the NIC that even through discussion in the NIC, we can't solve. So the Course Kata platform has been designed to support experiments. So for instance, that video clip that you saw, in the winter, half of students saw a version of the course that included that clip and many, many others. And half of the students in the classes did not. They weren't delivered the video. So even though they were in the same class, some of them had the option to watch the video and some did not. So that way we can do like A/B testing in the course. So some of the things that come up in the NIC are things that become experiments that we test in future implementations of the course. The other thing worth saying about the NICs, I think, is that because we have a lot going on and a lot of improvements going on at once, it can be a little bit of a bear to coordinate, especially if we're all improving the course. Something like Google Docs can help, but that doesn't track things very well. And it's not really designed for the purpose that we have in mind. So we are using Git, which is something that is used normally in computer programming, but that suits us well. So it's a way of tracking changes in a set of files. So we have a repository that includes all of the textbook materials that are written in Markdown so that they can be swept right in. Any changes that we made are immediately swept into what's being delivered live to students. And so it supports distributed nonlinear workflows. So there might be several NICs working on different parts of the book at the same point in time. So if I'm working on a change, I might check, if I go to the master, I might check out the master. I might make a series of changes to it, and then send a pull request to get feedback and have other people on the team review it and have the changes tested before they get merged back into the master branch. But even while I'm doing that on my branch of the master, there might be other team members. So like Adam might have created a branch somewhere else to make other changes, and G has created a branch somewhere else, starting it somewhere else, and might be pulled in at some later point. So it's really a nice way of keeping a master going, having a master version going that gets delivered out to students, but we get to, in parallel, be making improvements to it from several different NICs. And then just a very brief, but I still think very important comment about the how. And I think all of this is just done with an attitude of humility. So we really come at this with a readiness, and I would even say an eagerness to be wrong, right? I don't think that this works if you have a big ego. If we're open to criticism and open to finding places where things can be improved by anyone, and anyone can suggest an improvement, then that's actually what leads improvement to happen. Yeah. So shout out to our amazing team. And of course, this is only part of it because we also have a large number of instructors that we're working with, and that number is growing all the time. But this is sort of our most internal team that I have to say it's just an honor to be working with, and they're just a load of fun as well. So, and that's where I'll stop.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. Really appreciate that talk. We want to turn now to questions, comments, discussion. We'll toggle back and forth between anybody who's raised their hands off of Zoom or wants to continue typing in the chat. Karen, I know you probably haven't monitored the chat, but you got to love this chat function in Zoom because there's this entire conversation string, and it's great to have other team members on this Zoom meeting because they're having these robust, back and forth with other people on this call. So hopefully that can continue in the remaining time we have. So we'll toggle back and forth again between anybody who wants to raise their hand or continue chatting. I don't think we have anybody on the phone. So Beth, I don't think you need to explain how to raise a hand because I don't see any phone numbers there. But I'm going to start off with a question as people are thinking about maybe asking another question. There's obviously this really robust technology platform that is the foundation for which you can actually do this work elegantly or seamlessly. But if you don't have this course kata platform to build the NIC on, what approach might faculty who want to basically have this concept of networked improvement communities, what lessons could they draw, or what could they use? Are there more generic technology platforms they could use to get started? This idea of this iterative, continuous improvement, attention to feedback in the student data. So, are there ways in which they could apply the concepts that Better Book is using in another context?
Sure. So I think what Course Kata provides us is kind of a seamless way of getting data and implementing changes. But I think those aren't the only ways to get data and implement changes. So you can think of any kind of, lesson study work is also a form of improvement, and it can be also a networked improvement community. So I think, and I've been involved in some projects where we, made iterative improvements to classroom lessons, where the NIC met on Zoom actually also, or on Skype, one of those at the time. So we didn't have the same data source that we have from Course Kata, and we didn't have the same way of capturing the changes and putting them into a lesson, but we developed our own ways of capturing data from classroom lessons. Sometimes we videotaped classroom lessons and we used those for discussion. And then we developed routines for making changes to the lesson plans on which they were taught. So I think course kata is lovely, but it's not the only way to get data and to implement changes in materials.
One follow-up question on that is, how do you start? And then I'll go to Shanamar.
Looking for interested people who have time, and that's the interested people are often the people who don't have time. But I think interested people with a common vision is the key part to starting.
Okay, Shanamar's question, what are the costs associated with the technology required to create this? And Shanamar, if you want to take yourself off mute and, okay.
Thanks for reading my question, Mark.
Did you want to add to your question, or?
No, is it too big?
Is the cost too big?
No, I guess is my question too vague? Sorry, I don't know if my.
So we've been fortunate that, in fact, before we came to the OPR, we had the basic platform was already under development through a grant from Chan Zuckerberg. So it's not a small thing to develop from the ground up, and we've done it with grant support. Not small grant support.
And I believe UN had a question about the possibility of creating similar textbook for other content, and Jim's response was, perhaps on a separate Zoom call, that's something that they could cover. So if there is an interest, you might want to chat it so Jim knows who to reach out to. So the next raised hand we have is, and I apologize if my pronunciation is bad, Sindarajan.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question, there was a comment on the chat window that ran by, and this had to do with doing random experiments using the platform. Can you, so there was something about using different versions of the book to do random experiments. Can you comment on that a little bit? Like how are you running these experiments? I'm assuming that this is all being delivered through Canvas or some LMS. So how are you doing this?
Yeah, so our course is always delivered through an LMS. Where possible, we use the LMS used at on the campus. So where that's, we have it set up to work with Canvas or with Moodle. If you at your campus use Blackboard, then we would have you use the free for teacher version of Canvas. And so it's always delivered that way through the LMS. And then what happens is when on the back end, we can set up that we can create two different versions of the course. So, you know, an A version and then modify it slightly for the B version. And then within any class, we can randomly assign the delivery of those two versions of the materials.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question is from Brian Self.
Yeah, hi Karen, thanks, very interesting. My concern with these is always, is there accessibility issues? So does this work with screen readers and is everything captioned? Because it'll help being within the LMS, but I'm not sure necessarily that course kata will be accessible.
Yes, thanks, it's a great question. The LMS helps, certainly putting, loading video helps with the captioning of that. And some of my team members might be able to say more on it, but I think where we run into the biggest problem is I'm not sure that DataCamp is accessible. And I don't know, we can even, Jim or G, is that correct? So I'm wondering about Learnosity.
Yeah, I can say something, which is we had the disability office at UCLA do an assessment of our platform, and they identified a number of improvements we could make to improve the accessibility. It's something that's on our list. It's important, and it's not terrible. So the screen readers work for all the text parts. The problem is that, like, the test questions that are embedded, I think those needed some change. We needed to change the readable captions for certain pictures. we've already captioned the videos. So it's something that's on our list, but hasn't gotten to the #1 slot yet, just because we have so many other things. But it's a great question.
Part of it is that we make use of a lot of data visualizations. And I think the community at large, just the world out there, is not quite sure how to describe them well. You know, it's hard to describe a graph succinctly and accurately well. And so our captions to those graphs could probably use improvement. But we actually think of this as like an improvement project because, you know, when you have like a scatter plot, it's very hard to figure out what is useful to somebody who can't see this to be able to explain this well.
Yeah, thank you. That because we're struggling with these issues on our grant as well, and trying to make sure we're covering all these issues.
Okay, any other questions for Karen or for the team?
And I'm sorry, what I should have had on a slide at the end, I meant to add it, is that you can visit all of these materials at coursekata.org. So all one word, course, and then kata.org. Right now, you can preview all of the materials if you sign up for an account. Oh, thanks, G just put it in the chat window. And we're working at the moment for making that sign up not necessary. We're not doing anything with the sign up information, so don't worry about giving us your email address. But you can actually see all of the materials at Course Kata, and that's sort of consistent with our notion is that we're presenting all of this information even to classes everywhere that's being made available for free.
Great. Thanks so much, Karen. And then we will post this Zoom video on your project page, on the Better Book project page on our website. So with that, we only have a few minutes. So I just wanted to thank Karen and Jim and G, the rest of the Better Book team, for doing this very first webinar for the Learning Lab. I wanted to just again remind everybody that we have 2 additional webinars coming up on humanizing online instruction and as well as deploying learning assistance in an online environment. So we really hope you'll join us for those. We have a community dinner coming up on August 18th. We have a number of people who have accepted that invitation. So I hope more will be able to join. I also wanted to mention we have 7 amazing new advisors to the Learning Lab, and we will introduce them at some point. Maybe some of them can even make our community dinner, and they will be up on our website shortly. And then finally, we will have a larger announcement about our partnership with the Foundation for California Community Colleges coming soon, but it's something that that we're very excited about, so stay tuned. And I do see last comment from Hal Alpert. I don't know if you want to say it out loud if you're still on the meeting, but we're happy to have comments as well. Oh, no mic, sorry. Okay. Your comment is in the chat. The problem of teaching and learning disconnected lessons can be a real one. Effectively integrating multiple lessons into a conceptual whole is a real challenge. One way I wish I was taught stats was as a matter of asking questions of the data, choosing the tool to answer the question and understanding the answer I got. Great 2 cents. So thank you for making that comment. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good Friday, good weekend. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope that you get to enjoy some summer before back in the crush of fall. But it's great to see everybody, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.